Hi there. Let's talk about 3D objects in Illustrator and see what kinds of things we can make. 3D is possible in Illustrator on a limited basis, and I'll show you how best to use it. All right. Couple things to point out. When you're using the 3D effects in Illustrator, they're simple. They're not going to be advanced like you might be used to in a traditional three-dimensional program. They're not even as good as the ones you can find in Photoshop. So it's very limited, but it does work in specific cases to do what you need. So let's look at what those are. First, let's go ahead and use a shape tool and draw an object. I'm going to go ahead and just draw a square. And purposefully, I'm going to set the fill color of the square and the stroke color. So I'm going to set the fill color to, let's say, like an orange, and maybe the stroke color I'll just leave kind of like a red or something like that. So I have this box, basic ordinary object. I'm going to select it, and what I'm going to do is go to the Effect menu, and I'm going to go to 3D Extrude. All right. So I'm going to click on 3D Extrude. I don't see anything just yet, but what I'm going to do is now select Preview. In this dialog box, now you can see that what it does is it takes that flat shape, tilts it, stretches it in perspective, and it inherits the color from the flat shape itself. So you can see the interior of the object retained the orange, and the outer stroke is the color of the outside container of the square or the cube now. If you look at your dialog box, there are some options you can adjust. For example, the depth. The depth is going to control the size of the object, how far it's been extruded or stretched. If I'm trying to get something that looks like a cube, I just kind of have to eyeball the point value here and move the slider to get it to be the length I want. Notice you can have a cap, which is an end cap, or you can make it hollow. There are also some beveling options here. You can change the way it's beveled or carved along the edge. It creates some interesting, more complex detailing. Or you can just leave it on none. In addition, if you want to position that object, you move the cube selector up here at the top. This is your perspective control. You don't have a camera and you don't have a perspective grid controlling your object in space. Instead, you're able to control the view and orientation of that individual object by itself. Something to keep in mind is that when you use this tool, all the objects that use it are independent and separate from one another. So if I create a new cube, it's not going to be in the same perspective as the one I just drew. And that's a little troublesome because this really isn't a three-dimensional environment. All right, so now I'm going to click OK, and now I've got my three-dimensional object on my page, which, believe it or not, is still a vector square. When I let go of it, it looks like a cube, but it's actually still that same flat shape I had drawn before. So if I change the color of that object, like the stroke, it automatically updates the three-dimensional object to match what I'm doing. If I said it's a none, it turns it off. If I scale it, it will distort, and that three-dimensional appearance will readjust. If I rounded the corners, it's going to adjust and change the way that three-dimensional object looks. So those same vector controls that I'm used to using are still there. Look, if I grabbed one of the anchor points and moved it, it's going to resize and reshape that three-dimensional object to match. Okay, so here's what happens if you want to do more modifications. Like, let's say I want to change the perspective of this object. That's when I can get myself into a little trouble. You might assume that you have to go back to the 3D Effect menu and click on Extrude again, but you don't want to do that. What that actually does is it applies a second 3D effect to that object. And it's going to distort it, and it might even crash Illustrator. So you really want to avoid it. It really gives Illustrator a headache when you do that. Instead, what you want to do is look for the appearance palette. The appearance palette is where all of these effects from the effect menu are stored and listed as they are applied in sequence to an object. So if I want to edit this one, I need to click on the 3D extrude and bevel from the appearance palette. Select preview again so I can see it. That way it brings up the original settings that were applied, and I can re-rotate that object or modify it or move it around in space in the proper way. So that appearance palette really needs to be used in conjunction with whatever 3D object you make. Okay, what else can we do with this? Let's try this. You can use the 3D tool on silhouettes to revolve shapes. How does that work? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pen tool and I'm going to go over here. Oh, that's a trip. Did not expect that to happen. It was remembering that previous object. Okay, got to let go of that first. All right, here we go. I'm going to draw something entirely new. Okay, that's weird. Oh, I know what's going on. Don't want to bore you with that. What was happening is Illustrator was remembering the 3D effect that was applied to the previous object and trying to apply it to my new ones. That isn't what I wanted to do. I had to change a little setting, which was force art to have new appearance or basic appearance. So what I'm doing is I'm going to draw a squiggly shape. Purposefully, I'm going to make it irregular like that. And I'm going to go back up to the top and try to make one side of that little squiggly line straight. And just make it like this, kind of just a wavy line. But I'm going to close that shape and go back to the beginning. So I now have this squiggly shape. Now selecting it, I'm going to try using the 3D Revolve on it and see what happens. So if I click 3D Revolve, I click on Preview, give it a second. Hello, Illustrator. There we go. So what did it do? It took that flat silhouette and it spun it 360 degrees. Imagine you had a potter's wheel and you had a piece of clay in the middle of the potter's wheel and you spun it 360 degrees and then you started to mold it into this shape. Or maybe you've used a wood lathe and you've spun a block and you've carved into it. Essentially, that's what we've done here. We've spun that object to create this three-dimensional rendering. It's made out of that spun object. This one happens to be a little bit complex, so my video card is struggling with it. That can happen sometimes, is these 3D objects can constrain what Illustrator can render. I'm going to go ahead and click OK and let it go. I'm also going to turn off the stroke on this. There we go. So those are the two main ways that you can build an object. You can build an object by extruding it, stretching the shape, or you can build one by spinning or revolving the shape. Now in practical terms, the last thing I'm going to show you is how this might affect typography. So let's say I take my type tool and I type out a word. Amazing. And I scale it up real big and I look for kind of a bold, thick font. Scale it up even more. And I'm going to give it a brighter color than the black. Just go ahead and go with orange. Click on Amazing. Now, I'm going to use the extrude effect on it. Drag that to the side, click Preview. There. And you can see that I can change the depth. I can change the rotation. So it took that flat 2D text and it put it into a three-dimensional space that I can use to make those 3D block letters. Again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but it is a way to add that 3D to your simple shapes and objects. What's neat is when you're using the type on it and it's still editable type, you can still type on it. And if I added a stroke, it would at least give me a double color on it. So it'd give me an inside color and outside color. All right, so that's some of the basics of using the 3D objects. Again, you can't do really detailed or fancy objects, but in simple scenarios, it's useful for creating the types of basic shapes you might want to be using in your art. All right, see you next time.